In 1950, a man who incessantly protested his innocence stood on the gallows as he waited for the executioner to pull the lever to end his life. Two brutal murders, a mother and a young daughter, suffered at the hands of what most thought to be a cold-blooded killer, the accused, and then convicted, husband. But later events determined that the convicted murderer had nothing to do with the death of his family, but the prosecution's star witness had a past of his own, leading investigators to the true culprit of the murders, and changed long-standing law demanding capital punishment for the crime of murder. On March 9, 1950, Timothy John Evans, 25 years old, stood convicted of murdering his young wife Beryl and his infant daughter Geraldine. Evans poised on the gallows and waited for the customary hood after consuming his last meal. As he stood over the trap door, Evans stated that he was innocent. Subsequent to Evans's death, the general public began to question whether Evans was truly guilty and asked the question that if Evans did not murder his wife and child, then who did? The answer as to the true assailant soon became apparent and exposed a most vicious killer. Timothy Evans and his young family lived at 10 Rillington Place, Notting Hill, London, where they moved during Easter of 1948. They lived in a top-floor flat of the building. Shortly after moving there, Beryl Evans, Timothy's young wife, gave birth to a baby girl the couple named Geraldine. In late 1948, Evans reported to the local police that his wife and baby were dead. When the police went to the residence, they found nothing at first. Then they searched the yard. The authorities found the deceased bodies of Geraldine and Beryl Evans in an outside wash house. Beryl's body had been found wrapped in a blanket and then in a tablecloth. An autopsy revealed she had been strangled, but the new mother suffered from a massive beating, judging from the bruises on her face. Mr. Evans, at first, notified authorities that a man in their building had performed a botched abortion on his wife, which resulted in her death. But under intense interrogation, Evans eventually confessed to the murder himself. Eventually, Evans recanted his confession, which most investigators believed to be contrived and coerced, and pointed his finger toward the abortionist. This time, he blamed him for the murder of both his wife Beryl and daughter Geraldine. Investigators seemed undeterred and charged Evans with the murder of his daughter and not his wife. Evans's trial began on January 11, 1950. The principal witness at the trial, a John Reginald Halliday Christie, gave damning evidence that contradicted Evans's claims that he had nothing to do with the deaths of Beryl and Geraldine Evans. Despite the fact that Christie possessed a lengthy criminal record, the defense called into question the credibility of the witness. But the jury found Timothy Evans guilty of murdering his daughter Geraldine, and the court sentenced him to death by hanging. On February 20, 1950, Evans's appeal failed, and the court sentence was carried out. But this was not the end of the story. The authorities believed they had the murderer, but during their search of the yard at the house located at 10 Rillington Place, they discovered several other things that they did not readily question at the time. For instance, a human femur was found to be propping up a fence. Several visible bones appeared on the ground during the search where police searched the yard. A human skull had been unearthed by a dog immediately after the authorities allegedly completed their searches of the yard. It became clear that authorities did not execute the search with any clarity, and it proved superficial. Had the police exhibited any forensic diligence, they would have noticed one individual who acted peculiarly and seemed eager to convict another for the crimes he himself committed. As the case went on, observers believed that Evans's confession had been extracted through coercion and duress. Various interviews conducted demonstrated that Evans was unaware exactly where his wife was buried. He also claimed that her body parts would appear in the drain located at the front of the residence. When police searched the drain, they found no human remains whatsoever. Evans was also unaware that his daughter had been murdered along with his wife. When authorities first interrogated Evans in London, they showed him the clothing from his wife and daughter and informed him where they had been found. When conducting this interrogation, police literally gave Evans enough knowledge about the case to accurately confess about the murders of his wife and daughter. Observers believed that Evans's confessions were a matter of the police inventing his culpability. On the other hand, Christie's statements were taken at face value and no further inquiry seemed necessary. The case seems to have been concluded until authorities turned their attention toward the convincing prosecution witness, Christie, and realized an innocent man may have been convicted for a crime that he did not commit. John Reginald Halliday Christie was born in Halifax, West Riding of Yorkshire, on April 8, 1899, and had a relatively uneventful childhood. As a young man, Christie enlisted and then served as an infantryman in World War I, joining the 52nd Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire Regiment. In 1918, Christie's regiment had been deployed to France, where he took the position as a signalman with the Duke of Wellington's West Riding Regiment. Christie suffered an injury from a mustard gas attack and spent a month in a hospital in Calais recuperating. Christie later claimed that as a result of the injury he sustained, he suffered blindness and became a mute for 3.5 years. Additionally, Christie maintained throughout his life that because of the gas injury, he could not speak above a whisper. Since then, there have been several criminologists that maintain that Christie's lack of audible discernment was a result of a psychological mechanism rather than any toxic effects of the gas. This was an apparent reach for sympathy rather than a legitimate wartime wound. Moreover, it appeared that Christie suffered for a lifetime with impotence. It seemed the only time he could have sex was with prostitutes, and he steadily gained a reputation with the nicknames of Reggie No Dick and Can't Do It Christie. Despite this lack of sexual proficiency, Christie married Ethel Simpson from Sheffield at Halifax Register Office. He remained impotent with his wife, but continued to have sex with prostitutes. After 4 years of marriage, Christie and Ethel separated, with him moving to London and Ethel staying with relatives in Sheffield. Following his marriage to Ethel and extending into the first 10 years of that marriage, Christie committed many crimes and served time in prison for those transgressions. While working as a postman, Christie stole packages and received a sentence after his trial on April 12, 1921, of 3 months. In January 1923, Christie was convicted of obtaining money under false pretenses and violent conduct, where he was held over and then sentenced to 12 months probation. He committed further crimes of larceny in 1924 and received 2 consecutive sentences of 3 and 6 months imprisonment from September 1924. Later in the decade, Christie's crimes became more violently defined when, in May 1929, he was convicted of assaulting a prostitute that he cohabitated with in Battersea and then sentenced to 6 months hard labor. It turned out that Christie attacked the woman with a cricket bat, in which the judge described as a murderous attack. In 1933, a court found Christie guilty of auto theft as he stole a vehicle from a trusting priest that befriended him. His sentence for that crime amounted to 3 months incarceration. After his release from prison in 1933, Christie and Ethel reconciled, and although he ceased his run of petty crimes, Christie continued to engage the services of prostitutes. In December 1938, Christie and Ethel moved to a ground-floor flat located at 10 Rillington Place at Ladbroke Grove, a rather run-down area of London. A 3-story brick terrace where the ground and first floors contained a bedroom, living room, and kitchen, but the second-floor flat had no living room. The building contained just one outside bathroom that the tenants had to share, as none of the apartments contained indoor plumbing. When World War II broke out, Christie applied and then appealed to become part of the War Reserve Police. Since it became evident that the powers hiring for the force were desperate for applicants, they either ignored his criminal record or just did not verify that he had one. Christie walked a beat near the Harrow Road police station where he met a woman and soon began an affair. The relationship lasted until 1943, when the woman's husband returned from duty in the war. He discovered Christie in his house and assaulted him brutally. In August of 1943, Christie met an Austrian munitions worker and part-time prostitute named Ruth First. First had been soliciting clients in a snack bar located at Ladbroke Grove. When the two went back to Christie's flat to have sex, at the height of his passion, Christie grabbed the woman by the throat and began strangling her. Eventually, First succumbed to Christie's grip. Panicking at the thought of murder, Christie buried First's body underneath the floorboards of his front living room, and then when the corpse began to emit an aroma, he buried her in the back garden at 10 Rillington Place. Subsequent to the Ruth First murder, Christie resigned as a special constable. The next year, he found employment as a clerk in a radio factory. He struck up a friendship with a fellow co-worker named Muriel Amelia Eady. In October 1944, he invited the young lady to his residence with promises that he had a special concoction that would cure her chronic bronchitis. While the young woman sat in Christie's flat, he gave her instructions to inhale from a tube connected to a jar that allegedly held a mixture. The mixture was Friar's Balsam, that Christie used to disguise the smell of domestic natural gas. Eady's back was turned toward Christie, and then he attached a second tube attached to the house's gas tap. Eady continued breathing, not knowing that she was inhaling pure natural gas. The gas Christie made her inhale was actually coal gas, which was pure carbon monoxide. Upon Eady losing consciousness, Christie sexually abused her and then strangled her to death. He buried her body right next to Ruth First in the back garden of the house. During Easter of 1948, Timothy and Beryl Evans moved into the top floor at 10 Rillington Place. Shortly thereafter, Beryl gave birth to a baby girl, Geraldine, in October 1948. Later, in 1949, Evans reported that his wife was dead. At first, Evans reported that his wife died as a result of a botched abortion performed by his neighbor, but then he confessed and was executed. 3 years after the murders of Beryl and Geraldine Evans, Christie lost his job at the Post Office Savings Bank due to his past criminal activities, but he found employment very quickly thereafter with the British Road Services at their Shepherd's Bush depot. At the concurrent time, new tenants moved into the building. Black immigrants from the West Indies took up residence at 10 Rillington Place, and this did not sit well with the Christies. The Christies regarded their new neighbors as inferior and despised them. Ethel went so far as to prosecute one of the neighbors for assault. Christie knew that if the neighbors started snooping around the garden, his crimes may be discovered. So, in a legal maneuver, Christie negotiated with an indigent defender attorney to continue to have exclusive use of the back garden, with the space separating him from the neighbors. His secrets remained secure, for the time being. On December 6, 1952, Christie resigned from his job. On the morning of December 14, 1952, Christie woke up and did not disturb Ethel. While she lay there peacefully sleeping, Christie gingerly placed his hands around her throat and strangled her to death. When neighbors and other residents in the area noticed Ethel missing, Christie responded to any queries about her disappearance with several stories. In a letter to relatives in Sheffield, Christie stated that his wife suffered from rheumatism and could not write the letter herself. To one neighbor, he stated that Ethel visited relatives in Sheffield, and to another, she was visiting Birmingham. Christie sold Ethel's wedding ring, his watch, and his furniture in order to support himself until he could, again, find gainful employment. He also had his unemployment to rely on, but he also went to the bank, forged Ethel's signature, and emptied her bank account on January 26, 1953. It seemed after Ethel's death that Christie began a short reign of murder that accelerated. Between January 19, 1953 and March 6, 1953, Christie murdered Kathleen Maloney, a prostitute from the Ladbroke Grove area, Rita Nelson, who was from Belfast, Northern Ireland, and visiting her sister in Ladbroke Grove when she met Christie and he murdered her, and Hectorina McClenna, who was living with her boyfriend in London. Christie invited all three of the women back to his residence, but with McClenna, he allowed her and her boyfriend to stay at 10 Rillington Place while they were looking for a residence. On one occasion, Christie found McClenna alone and invited her back to his residence. He strangled her there, and when Baker came looking for her, Christie informed the boyfriend that he had not seen her. Occasionally, Christie would meet with the young man to feign interest at the fate of the girl, even though he knew McClenna was dead. These three women, unfortunately, were Christie's last three victims. At this time, he slightly adjusted his method that he had first utilized with Ruth Eady. His improved method consisted of just a small bulldog clip on a hose that was connected to the gas line. He seated the victims in the kitchen, released the clip on the tube, and released the gas into the room. Later, authorities determined that this method was obsolete, and Christie would have suffered from the gas as well. The investigators truly believed that the last three victims succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning. The authorities also learned that Christie raped his victims while they were unconscious. After murdering the three women, Christie hid the bodies behind a small alcove behind the kitchen wall, which he then covered with wallpaper. He wrapped the victims in blankets, then placed them in the alcove. On March 20, 1953, Christie moved out of 10 Rillington Place, and he illegally sublet the apartment. When the landlord for the building visited the residence, he became incensed that Christie was nowhere to be found and ordered the tenants to leave the next morning. The tenant on the top floor, Beresford Brown, requested that he be allowed to use Christie's kitchen, a request which the landlord granted. On March 23rd, Brown attempted to install a shelf for a wireless set and discovered the alcove. When Brown pulled back the wallpaper covering the alcove, he discovered the bodies of Maloney, Nelson, and McLennan. Once Brown alerted another neighbor, and they confirmed that they were indeed dead bodies, he summoned the police. Once the police arrived and made some inquiries, a citywide search commenced looking for Christie. Subsequent to his leaving Rillington Place, Christie checked into Rowton House in King's Cross, where he booked a room for 7 nights under his real name and address. Christie only spent 4 nights there, leaving the residence when news of the body's discoveries hit the newsstands. He just wandered around London, spending most of his time in cafes. On the morning of March 31st, 1953, a police officer challenged Christie when he ran across him on the embankment near Putney Bridge. When asked to empty his pockets, the only thing Christie produced were some coins and an old newspaper clipping regarding the remand of Timothy Evans. The officer took the pathetic man into the police station. Authorities believe that Christie may have been a tough nut to crack, but while in custody, he confessed to the murder of 7 women. Christie also confessed to the murder of Beryl Evans. The court determined that they would only charge Christie with the murder of Ethel Christie, even though his confession proved authentic. Christie was brought before the Crown on June 22, 1953, in the same courtroom in which he testified against Timothy Evans. At first, Christie pled not guilty by reason of insanity and claimed that he had no memory of the events at all. The jury rejected the plea, and after a very short trial, the jury only deliberated for approximately 85 minutes and then found Christie guilty. The convicted man refused to appeal his conviction, and on July 15, 1953, Christie stood on the gallows. Prior to the executioner pulling the lever to release the trapdoors, Christie stated that his nose itched. The executioner responded, that it wouldn't bother him for much longer. After Christie's conviction, controversy surrounded the verdict and execution of Timothy Evans. Evans had an IQ of 70, and Christie influenced the young man to take the blame for Christie's crimes. With Christie's confession and conviction, many observers even questioned the fairness of Evans's trial. It took 10 years, but the British government granted Evans a posthumous pardon on October 18, 1966. Because of this case, with all the controversy running rampant, the British government declared the death penalty abolished. Historians and criminologists make the contention that Christie must have murdered more victims, and such killers fail to stop themselves. During the course of Christie's trial, authorities introduced evidence that the defendant collected the pubic hairs of his victims as trophies. However, the authorities made no effort to discover whether Christie had other victims than the ones he admitted to killing in the bodies found at 10 Rillington Place. Until next time.